Welcome to the 6-part mini tutorial series where I take you through the process of creating a stylized game asset. This series assumes that you have an understanding of Maya and you have an understanding of Substance Painter. If you would like to learn more about 3D, or if you would like to learn more about the softwares, check out our courses on Udemy. You can find a link for that down in the description. In this section of the tutorial series, we're going to continue to explore Substance Painter by looking at how we can use various tools within the software to add detail to our asset. We're going to take a look at using some of the generators that are inside of Substance Painter, as well as taking a look at some of the various texture masks that we have access to. All right, so let's go ahead and start building up some detail on this. There's a number of ways we can do this. We can do this through generators. We can do it through hand painting. We can do it through using materials. So let's explore a couple options. What I'm going to start with is maybe exploring some generators, and we're just going to do so by creating a new fill layer here. And you can right-click the fill layer here to add a black mask. And in this black mask, you can right-click to add various things. So in this particular instance, what I'm going to look for here is going to be something called a generator. If you add in a generator, generators can use a wide range of different information inside of Substance Painter to add details to your object. So if you click on this, you'll see all sorts of generators. What I'm going to look for here is going to be, let's see, something like an edge here. You can use metal edge. And if we go ahead and do that, you'll see it's going to add metal edges, just like that. Now, how is this working with our generator? Well, it's coming down here and it's using various inputs to drive this. So you'll see it's using world space normals, position, curvature, and ambient occlusion. All of these maps are contributing to this. And if I go ahead and increase things like the wear level, it'll increase the amount of wear, which I don't want a whole lot, but maybe a little bit more than I have. We can play around with things like the wear contrast, which is the amount of contrast between the wear level and the surface. We can play around with things like triplanar blending, grunge amount, grunge scale. So you can see you could use all of these here, which is really nice. Things like edge smoothness, ambient occlusion, curvature weight, and just kind of see how you want this to go. Now, I think this is good enough. I'm going to make this for my metals here. And I'm just going to grab a color here and grab a color that's lighter than my metal. If you're using a reference, you can steal directly from it. Be ultimate lazy, I have a reference on my other screen, or you can find one for yourself. Now, I'm going to turn all of these off though, and I'm just going to drop this under my metals tab here. So now I just have this affecting my metals. Now, if you're in a pipeline that allows you to use things like roughness and allows you to use things like normal maps, you could also consider coming in here and enabling something like height. And you could just tone the height up or down to make it look like it's indented. I don't necessarily suggest this though with metals. A lot of the times you don't need this, but if you do, it'd be really low, like 0.001 in some cases would be fine. But since this is right along an edge, we probably don't want that. So we do want to have that set up. We can, however, consider adjusting this a bit more. Now that we see, it's fairly subtle, you might actually consider increasing something like the grunge amount here to get a little bit more grunge, a little bit more wear, depending on what you're going for. I think I want to still go with something pretty subtle here and maybe just mostly along the edges just to add that nice feel. All right. Now we could do the same with wood, actually. We could come up here and we could just grab a layer again, add a black mask, add a generator. And we could still come in here and grab metallic edges. If I type in edge, you'll see it's really the only one that comes up. You either have fiberglass here, which really isn't what we're looking for. But depending on how it goes for wood, it actually might be good for that top part. So that's something we might consider because that does kind of look like what we were getting, which is kind of interesting. So that's a happy accident. That's going to require some blending and some masking, but we could create a sort of compound effect if we want to try using that one out. But the one that I did like was the metallic edges here. And with the metallic edge, it sounds silly, but we do have worn edges on our barrels, areas that are a bit lighter. So this can actually be a good base start point, even though it says metal. Okay. Now we need to come in here to the parameters and kind of determine what this is going to entail. how much wear do we want, how much contrast, coming in and adding in scratches to the wood there. Grunge amount, in this case, we probably would want to really reduce the grunge amount, maybe even all the way. Play around with edge smoothness here. And you'll see with the grunge amount gone, we actually just have the edges left, which actually might work to our advantage depending on what we want to achieve. You can see as we add the grunges, we do end up getting that on the center area. So if we're just trying to lighten the edges a bit, then this could be a good way to go. And we can actually layer this with other effects. So I could come up here and I could right click and we could add in something like a fill here rather than a generator. And the cool thing about adding in a fill is we can use this on top of our generator. Now, if you go ahead and exit out of here into textures, you can see we have all sorts of interesting textures in here we can grab. And we can grab something that just kind of breaks this up, even something that breaks it up in terms of directionality. So for example, that would run side to side, kind of giving it some wear. That might be an interesting way to go. We could just drag and drop that onto grayscale. And you can see how that's going to kind of wear down the side. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, but we lose the edges. Well, if you come over here, you'll see that these have blending modes, and we could use something like a multiply on this one to multiply on top. Remember, masks are black and white. Black, you're going to have something there, or you're going to have transparency, and white, you're going to have something there. So that takes it away, and you can use something like balance here to make it more or less. To add some wear to that, you could use contrast to make it more scarce. So you can see how you can stack this effect. Now we can continue stacking this effect using other factors as well. For example, we could add a fill here. I could come up to something like a 3D texture. And the cool thing about 3D textures is they're going to ignore UV seams for the most part. Now, interestingly enough, this is taking a while to load. You can see how long it took down there. But we can play around with things like the scale on this in terms of size. And we could use something like a multiply here to add a higher level of breakup to that. I'm not really liking this too much, but if we play around with these, we might be able to get something we like. That breaks this up. Now, I think I'm actually going to scratch this all together because, no, it's just not suiting me. So I'm going to delete that. But hopefully that gives you some ideas on how you can build that up. Now, let's go ahead and explore some other factors, though. If you come over here into these textures here, you'll actually see they have a lot of different ones. And if we type in something like wood, you'll see that they have some different grunges, but they also have this wood right here we can play around with. So if we wanted to do wood grain, we could try hand painting it, or we can drag and drop this into a mask. So I'm going to right click. We can go ahead and add a black mask. We could add a fill. And we can bring this into here for our wood grain. Now you'll notice it's running the wrong direction. At the top of the attributes of any sort of layer, you'll find this UV section, and you can actually apply rotation here. So we'll just rotate 90 degrees. And then the coloration's a little bit off. Well, the reason we're using fills is we can change this to whatever coloration we want. So I could come in here and use my little eye picker and sample a different color. And you can see now, if we go into the base color, we're getting a different wood grain color, which is great. I'm going to make it more apparent, though, for now. We'll set it back to white just so we can see this better. We can adjust the wood grain down here when it's a texture that is native to Substance Painter. So, for example, we can adjust the hardness here, and we could reduce the number of knots in the wood. So for this instance, I might remove the knots altogether and give it a nice softness. So this way we just get a bit of wood here that has some nice shading. We could also play around with things like tiling to change the size of this. So maybe I want a larger grain wood, like so. I think it's pretty much at the default. But now I could just sample in the color here. I could grab whatever color it is I want this wood grain to appear as. And now you'll see we're getting that grain in there. Now, the other cool thing is if we're using things like height, since this is applied to a mask, you could push this in or out and just get a little bit of detail there just to have a nice stylized wood. And we can just name this our grain. Now, I don't really plan on using a normal map here, so I might pull that height down, bring this under here, and there we go. And just set this to color for now. So we're getting that as a base. And that's a very quick way for us to just get some nice wood-looking effects. nice quick stylized wood. And we do have the ability to come in here and adjust this wood grain. We can add knots to it if we want. We can play around with the hardness or softness. And of course, we can pull around with things like the tiling, which in turn changes the scale. Now, I'm not 100% sold on this one. I think I'd prefer to create my own hand-painted texture. We could, however, start bringing in other elements as well that allow us to kind of control this on a different level, like these stylized assets they already have in here. So we explored that previously, but they did have a stylized wood under the base here. So we could come in here to the wood stylize and bring this on top at this point and decide how we want to use this. Now, I'm not 100% sure why this is having some weirdness to it. It does have some interesting effects going here. But I probably only want this to affect the color. So that is a start. Also just surprised at whatever that is, but yeah, okay. But we could come down here and adjust things. So for example, the wood color, we could play around with setting this to a grayscale value. We could also just leave it at its default and make it grayscale by coming in here and adding something like a filter. And inside of the filter here, we could try a gradient like we did earlier. And if we go ahead and apply that, it'll turn grayscale, in which case we could come in here to something like an overlay. And now we could just have this overlay on top of our existing material. If we wanted to add in something like our height or normal map, you can see we can do that. And of course, we could come and drag and drop this underneath our wood here. So very quick procedural way to do this. I'm going to get rid of the height and normal and roughness. And we could just play around with things like the wood fibers here, wood variation. I think I'm going to get rid of the intersize variation here and probably dial back the deformation a little bit. You can play around with the density here. I think pulling that back looks a lot nicer. And I'm actually enjoying that quite a bit. There are some areas that I feel look kind of weird. There's a little chunk out of there. But we can adjust things like highlight intensity, which is really nice, and shadow intensity, and get a pretty nice looking stylized effect here. All right, cool. So I'm actually liking that quite a bit. If we are going to play around with normals, we might as well include them. And then we can come in here and adjust those as well. I'm not sure where the dials are for those ones. Huh. If you're not sure, you can come in here and lower the opacity of these. So for example, let's say I didn't like the opacity on these. You can actually change your channel up here to something like height. And if I come in and adjust this here, you'll see that's a way I can lower that. And in this instance, I actually might lower it all the way or really low. And then I could also switch this to something like normal and lower this down really low. So that way I'm getting the subtle effect I'd want a barrel to have, rather. I could also bring in something like the roughness here to add in the roughness variation, and there you go. Now I'm going for more of a flat lit look, so I might actually opt to go with neither of those. In which case, I might actually come into the base color here and lower the opacity of it to just be a little bit more subtle and guided, I guess you could say. I could also play around with the gradient as well. We could use these color dials here to kind of change where things are affecting, which is kind of cool. So you can see we have quite a bit of control over this. We can map this to respective colors. So let's say I had a dark color in mind. I could turn this to normal instead of having it as an overlay. So you see an overlay. It's just doing the math there. It's lightening and darkening our base. But I could use this as the base, and I could pick a color for my darks. So we could find the darkest dark we want to have. I could pick a color for my midtones. And I could pick a color for my highlights, and you'll see that the highlights are actually 90% of this right now. But now if I adjust these dials, we'll get a more subtle look to the wood and have a nice effect. I think I need to pick a much darker dark here than what I have currently. And just make sure that's pretty low on the totem pole there. but you can see how we can use this to dial this up and down. Now, I think I like the default grayscale better with an overlay, so I'm going to undo those and just kind of bring it back to what I had. But hopefully that gives you some ideas on things you can play around with there to just kind of push the stylized aspect of your asset. Now, you also notice that our grain is mismatching here, and this has to do with how things are projected. So if I come in here to the stylized wood rough and we look at the projection, you'll see it's UV projection. That means it's projecting in UV space over here. So it's projecting flatly. That means it doesn't run across here. And if we wanted the wood grain to be continuous, I could actually switch this to triplanar. And what that will do is it will use a 3D projection instead. And you'll see now that we do get sort of a continuous grain across some of these, not all of these. But in a way, it actually is reminiscent of our reference here, where the wood was kind of sliced in different directions. So that's one of those things where it's like, well, maybe I actually don't mind that. So it just kind of depends on what you're going for. The advantage to having it set to UV projection here is that the wood grain all runs in the same direction, which if you wanted to do some hand-painted corrections, you could correct just hand-painting across. The nice thing about triplanar is you don't really need to worry about it so much. It just kind of goes across and there you go. Now you will notice that the scale changed though, and that's a factor with triplanar, so you might need to come in here and dial up or down the scale of this. That is sometimes something you need to do. The other thing is you'll notice the top part's not running in the right direction, so if you need to, you can actually rotate the triplanar here, so that way it aligns correctly with your various wood slats, in which case these ones are going to have an incorrect section. So yeah, you're not really getting a good result out of any of this. So in this particular case, UV projection it is. I'm going to undo a couple times, but I did want to show that so you could see it. And like I mentioned, there are some issues there. We have an obvious UVC. We're going to need to fix that if we, are going to keep that, I guess. So just kind of depends on how detailed you want to get. Now, we could remedy all this by just hand painting the wood grain or approaching it a different way, potentially. So that is also something to consider when you are going about doing this, all right? But hopefully that gives you an idea on how to approach some of the stylized stuff with the wood grain there, using this as a base material if you wanted to take that approach. Now, let's go ahead and just build up something instead. I'm going to create a new layer here. And we could actually make this a different color. So I'm going to do a couple variations. Let me find my reference here, though. So I'm pulling from the right image. I'm going to start by just creating a very dark color. And we'll go ahead and just name this one our darks. And inside of here, I'm going to add a black mask and I'm going to add a fill. And if we come over to the grunges here, you'll see there's various wood grunges we could use, like this one here. And this will fill this in. Let me go ahead and turn on my base color here so we can see it. And you can see we could use something like tiling to make this appear. This one has a lot of wooden knots though, so I'm not a big fan there. Instead, we could come to the fill here and we could try something a little bit different. Maybe not something with wood, but just something that has lines, and we could build up a wood grain. So things like directionals are really good. Something like this directional noise 2 would be really good. So if I slap that into our grayscale, let me go ahead and darken this so we can actually see it. You can see the effect that has. I will need to rotate this 90 degrees. Make sure you have the effect clicked on when you rotate it 90 and the layer, but we can rotate that 90 and we can start to build up a wood grain. So in this particular instance, we can use things like balance down here to affect this, things like contrast. And we can just kind of pick the colors that we want to have moving forward here. So I'll start with a dark, not necessarily black. Like I mentioned, I might want to grab a dark from my image as sort of a base. And that could be a way to start, just kind of adding in some breakup, some wood grain. Once again, I'm in the base color here, but now if I were to set something like height, you'll see we actually have full control here of just adjusting this a bit. I could also come into things like roughness and increase the roughness. If I was going for something more like stylized realism, you can see how that's already starting to look like weathered wood. Now, I also want to, determine how dark I want this to go. I might push this a little bit darker depending on where I'm at. but I think I'm going for something fairly subtle, so I'm just going to leave that be. One thing I might do, however, is play around with the tiling here, because I might want the tiling to be more obvious, meaning I'm going to go with something larger. So let me go ahead and make this easier for you to see, and for me to see, I guess. But the idea behind this is to give us some variation. Now, I can also stretch this more. If I break this link here, I could make these more elongated. And then I could come down here and play around with the balance here to make these more or less full, which sounds weird, but actually has some purpose here with how I'm going to approach this. And this can kind of expedite us from having to do a lot of hand painting. It's not always faster, though. It really depends on your personal preferences. So I'm going to go with something like that for now and just go back to being my lighter dark color. And we'll go ahead and turn off the other parameters. And I'm going to bring this under the thickness, so we're getting the thickness there. And you can see that's still pairing with the wood base. I'm then going to Control D here, and we're going to make one here called Lights. I'm just going to sample a lighter color. And now the tricky part is to actually do the exact same thing we just did, but offset from the original. So we can do this a number of ways. We can come into here, into layers, and we can use offset. And we can determine how effective we want this to be. We could also invert this. So if we wanted to have less lights, you can actually apply these adjustments here. The filters to masks. So we could come in here and invert. And we could actually invert that so the lights are in a different spot entirely, inverted. And we could sample a light color. So now you'll see we have that, and you can see how these are now building off of each other. And we could even pick sort of a mid color. So I'm going to come into the middle here. I'm going to pick a mid color. Just so I can see it in contrast to the darks, though, I am going to make this black and save myself some time. I'm actually going to duplicate the lights. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is going to be a mid color, so let me just make it like a middle gray. But I want this to also be in a different spot. So in this particular instance, you know, how this interacts. Maybe I have this inverted, but now I play around with something like the balance here and the contrast. I don't want to get that much texture out of it. And then maybe some things like the noise parameter here. And since this is the mid-tone, you know, maybe give it a little bit more fill to it. I could even change the angle if I wanted to. I don't. There's also an angle random, which might be kind of interesting to randomize these a bit more. And I can actually do this across all of them. But something like that, and then I can see how this interacts with the lights. So we have some lights overlapping, some darks pointing through. I like that. Let's go ahead and just come in here to the direction noise and just add some random here, just a little bit. And then do the same thing with the darks. And I'm doing this while I can still see all of these. So angle random. And then in the midtone here, I'll just grab my middle color, which is kind of the base color, and place that in there. And voila, we have that effect. All right, so you can see how these all kind of build up on each other. Now, if we want to keep that original base still, what we could do is we could use some opacity. So for example, I could come in here to the darks and I could reduce this down. Then I could come into the midtones and I could reduce this down. And then I could come into the light area here and I could reduce that down a bit. And that way I just get a nice light texture to this without getting, you know, anything super aggressive. So a nice subtle look. And the nice thing is the crossover here looks a little bit better. Now, if we did want to get that top area going there, if you remember that one edge technique we saw looked pretty good. So we could come in here to the filters. We could come in and we could add in a generator. Come to our generators and do fiberglass. And I did like that for this top area. So let me go ahead and switch this. Notice I didn't attach this to a mask. That's a mistake. I always want to add a black mask, add fill, and add generator and attach it that way. The reason why I do this is it gives me more control. If you notice everything went black and white there, you don't want to assign it to a color normally. You want to assign it to a mask. There are situations where you might want to put it on a color, but generally speaking, you always want to mask it. So with this, I have a lot of control here to kind of make this top part look pretty worn out, which is something that I might want to do. And I'm just playing around with the dials here to kind of see what does what. I'm probably going to want to keep the curvature weight pretty high there, so that way I maintain that curvature. Maybe not too high though. And get something like that going. And then I can just pick a color that I feel is appropriate for this. And this could be from my source. It could also be from somewhere else. The source has sort of this pinkish color going here. Don't know if I really like that, overall, but we can get that set up. And then, as I showed you earlier, we can combine masks with this. So we can make this our top wear. We could come in here and we could control this with a paint mask. So I could just add paint, and this is going to let us paint directly. If you come in here to the paintbrush, there's some nice grunge map in here. For example, if I come in here to something like the Artistic Heavy, that could be a good one. And you can either paint directly on here or you paint elsewhere. In this instance, I'm going to hit X to switch to black, and we're just going to paint. Now, usually I like to paint on UVs. I like to come over here and just paint this area. It's a little bit easier, I feel. And we could come in here and just paint this to where we just have that wear along the top area there. And you can take your time with it to make it more subtle than what I am doing. I'm going through this pretty quickly, but you can see how we can customize where this goes, which is really nice. There we go. You could also affect the top area a bit more if we wanted to. We could affect that interior area a bit more, and we might want to go for that one. That one we need to find the interior one for, which is in shading here. And I'm guessing if we find the UV seam, that's one of the easiest ways to kind of determine this. But we could paint across here and try and figure out what's the top and what's the bottom. So in this instance, I think this is the bottom area here. So we could take some time here, just kind of painting along there. Now you do have to be careful. There are different painting modes that I haven't gone into. Right now, we're actually in something called tangent wrap, and it will wrap up and around this onto the actual object, which isn't really ideal. But yeah, you can see it happening there on the base, but that's fine because I actually want to remove it from the base. Main area, I just don't want it to be removed from, is that top area there. But yeah, something like that. Now for this one, I could use this object here, which is the fill polygonal. And you can see right now it's into polygonal fill. I could do a UV chunk fill and just click on that to fill it. You'll notice I filled it the wrong color. I want to fill it with black, and I just did that by pressing X. Now, the last thing I need to do at the top wear is just consider dialing this up or down to give us more or less wear. So that way we get something a little bit nicer looking. And if there's any areas that I feel need a little bit more love, we can come in here and we can paint this out. And notice I can't just paint this. It's having an issue there. What I would need to do is set my paint layer to a multiply. And then with that set to a multiply, I can now paint this back in with white to be able to affect that. And an interesting thing is I can also use this to kind of add in some interesting looking edge wear. Just along the barrel here, you'll see if I just go ahead and paint this, it allows me to get that rough edge wear I was actually trying to get previously, but now I'm getting it manually. If I go into the base color, you can see this a little bit better where I can just kind of paint that up. And now that effect that I was trying to achieve with a bunch of, random stuff earlier, I can actually just get through this for free, which is cool. Now, I don't really have a style I'm trying to follow, so I will fully admit this is turning into a little bit of a mess. It's probably not what I intended it to be, but welcome to randomly deciding you're going to make a stylized barrel one day and turn it into a series of recordings. But, you can see that using this manual masking technique, it's very useful. Gives you a lot of control. And what's neat is I have multiple levels of mask interaction here. I have the initial mask with the color selection. I have my hand painted masks. I have all the filtered masks. really nice amount of effects going on here to make this possible. So very nice. And I can actually just paint across here, which is kind of cool. It's not going to hurt anything because I have that color selection mask in place. So it allows me to work very much freely across here to add in this effect. So I'm going to take a moment just kind of painting these in. As with any sort of 3D art, just take your time with it. I've been kind of flying through this one pretty quickly, mainly because this is just a for fun after work project I'm doing today to get my feet wet. It's been a few days since I made any 3D art, so I was getting the hankering to make something. We haven't really addressed the metal too much. The metal is kind of okay. It's not really needing that much love. Metals are kind of weird like that, especially if you're in a metalness workflow. A lot of the metal, it just comes from turning on your metal dial. But we could add in some color variations like we've added to the wood, and we could decide if it's a special type of metal. Now, something you might notice is I am getting some lag here. Painting. This is actually an issue that I run into with Substance Painter is pretty much all Adobe products are just complete resource hogs on your machine. And I don't know what it is with painting on here, but the longer you stay on a layer, the less responsive your tools get. And it is very annoying. Something they definitely need to fix. All right. So coming down into here, we could paint some of this across the top area if we want to get some indication of wear between these boards here, and I might just go with a larger brush for this and just paint down the center line to save some time. And I'm actually going to blend this down more with opacity again because I don't like it too opaque there, and that's just going to give us a nice look. All right, so save. If you need to reorder some of your layers, you can. For example, if I wanted that on top of the thickness, I could put it there or underneath it, or even underneath some of the other wood grains. And you can see that has a very different effect where we get the wood grains on top now. We're still getting this lightning, and we can play around with, which portion of the stack that goes under. So we have a lot of really fun control there. Now, if I bring that on the materials, you see how that looks. With this one, I'd want to turn off everything but the roughness and the color. And the one adjustment I'd want to make is just crank the roughness up so that way we get the rougher edges there. Okay, so that's going to give us some stylized layers of wood. The next thing might be to do some hand painting on those, but before we do, let's go ahead and get into just some base buildup on the metals. You kind of want to work your way across this evenly as you go. So let's get the metals looking similar to this. We have our metal base. I'm just going to do the same setup here. We're adding some variations of metals. So I'll just start with the first one here. We can add a dark metallic color here. I'll just go ahead and sample a darker area than what we currently have, and you can see the effect that has there. And then if you come over the filters here, you could look under something like metals, and you can see there's a couple different types of metal here. You can determine how you want to do this. Generally speaking, you're going to have different types of metal. So this one's pretty nondescript. We could actually achieve this with some different levels of noise. And that's actually what we see across a handful of these. But sometimes you have directionality, like metal striations. So you kind of have to pick what you want to do with yours, what you want to achieve. I kind of like the idea of just something kind of noisy. So I might actually look at some of these noises. Something like this is pretty corrosive. We could add a black mask, add a fill, and just drop this onto here. And you'll see that we get some nice dots. And yeah, I don't really have any issues with that. You could play around with things like the balance and various adjustments, but yeah, I actually like that by itself. So I'll just go ahead and make this darks. So we have that over the metal base. And if we bring this into the metallic color, you'll see this is non-metallic. We're just going to want to come in here and turn off everything here. So it just complements the metalness there. And then we can add in another layer here. This time, maybe shooting for something a bit lighter. I might come in here and grab the lights. And we could actually look for something like scratches. And you'll see there's a lot of different types of scratches we have here. I'd want to go with one of the more subtle ones here. This one might be too much, but just to see it, let's go to black mask, add fill, and we could throw this onto here. And you can see that we could use this to get some nice scratches across here. We could adjust the effects here. For example, down here, you have things like scratch quantity. You could come in here to things like the scratch width to alter these, scratch length. So if I wanted to just get something a bit subtle and look at the base color there, we could play around with scratch masking, scratch dirtiness, which is how broken up they are. We could come in here and do double scratches if we want to have more than one scratch in a spot. So we could play around with this to get some different scratches. Now, this one's a little bit strong for me, so I think I'll just come in here and add fill. And we can look at some of these ones that are a little bit more scarce here. Maybe something like this that just has some generic wear and tear. I'm also going to switch this from UV to triplanar. That way it doesn't affect the UVC. And then for this one, you can see the balance effect, what that's doing. We could also come into something like tiling for more repetition to make it smaller and more subtle across the surface and maybe a little bit more abundant. And then we could play around with things like contrast and balance to affect this and add more or less of this sort of scratching effect. Now, this is pretty obvious, though, tiling, so I don't really want that. But you could play around with those. Now, I don't know if I want any sort of scratches on this one. I might just go with something a little bit more subtle altogether. This might be the golden one, though. Honestly, I think that's fine. You can just do a quick triplanar on it. Just want to check and make sure I'm not getting a lot of repetition, though. I am going to rotate it a bit, potentially, and play around with some of the settings down here. So we just get something a little bit more subtle. And that looks pretty good. Coming into here, we can adjust the settings. So we just have color. And now you can see that this is pretty equal across the board in terms of the metal and wood. The metal might be a little bit stronger than the wood. We could always dial these down or up with opacity here, so they're more or less subtle. I think the darks are actually one of the things that really makes that pop, which is kind of interesting. And of course, the highlights. So this is our middle highlights. I might want to dial those back just a bit, the edge wear. Well, actually, I'll keep that there. Just keep all of it. Why not? But that will give us that setup there. And, I'd say it's probably more tuned for this workflow here than this workflow. But it's something we could definitely work with and continue playing with to get a nice look. Okay, so that's going to get us some levels of generator in there. The next thing to explore is maybe some hand painting. So let's go ahead and save what we have, and we can take a look at that next. Thank you for watching this tutorial series. Be sure to like and subscribe for future content.